The year is 1962. The Cold War rages fiercer than ever. Tensions between the US and the USSR are rising. The Berlin Wall divides Germany, showing the stark contrast between capitalism and communism. The Cuban Missile Crisis sees the world come the closest to all-out nuclear war than it has ever been, and newly elected President John F. Kennedy has inherited a growing crisis: Vietnam. The state of Vietnam was formed from the territories of Indochina, a French colony, after the Second World War. However, communist revolutionary Ho Chi Minh led an uprising against it, resulting in the division of Vietnam into two regions. In the north, a communist regime backed by the USSR, and in the south, a capitalist regime backed by the US. This ideological divide quickly escalated into a full-scale proxy war, drawing in foreign powers as Cold War tensions intensified. The Vietnam War stretched until 1975 and was one of the most turbulent and significant conflicts of the 20th century. Although it was fought primarily on Vietnamese soil, its effect rippled throughout Southeast Asia and became a defining moment for Australia's foreign policy. After America's decision to enter the Vietnam War, Australia quickly followed, sending a task force to train Vietnamese soldiers in 1962 and the 1st Battalion RAR in 1965.
The primary justification for entering the Vietnam War was the domino theory. The cartoon from the Catholic News Weekly highlights how people believe that if Vietnam fell to communism, Malaya, Indonesia, New Guinea, or even Australia could be next. The public sentiment around the ideological threats of the Vietnam War implied that Australia believed communism could be contained by joining the war, protecting Australia. Furthermore, this is corroborated by the Liberal Party's poster, which asked its viewers where they would draw the line against communism, suggesting that if Australia didn't act now, it would be threatened by communist expansion. Moreover, as a war on Australian soil was considered unwinnable, the theory at the time was that Australia would need a proactive strategy of forward defence and have to fight communism before it ever reached Australian shores.
Australia's support for the containment of communism through backing the American and South Vietnamese effort to suppress the Communist North is embodied in Prime Minister Harold Holt's slogan, introduced during the war, which read "All the way with LBJ," highlighting the willingness of Australia to follow President Lyndon B. Johnson's war in his leadership of the US support to the South. Domestically, the war sparked intense division. At first, many Australians supported involvement, trusting the government's stance. But as the years dragged on, and as the human cost became clear, public sentiment shifted. Protests erupted across the country, and a powerful anti-war movement emerged, questioning both the morality and the efficacy of the mission. Despite years of effort, the war ultimately ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon, leaving many to question what, if anything, had been achieved. And so we ask, did Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War meaningfully halt the spread of communism in the Asia-Pacific, or was it ultimately a futile conflict that unnecessarily cost Australian lives?
Although Vietnam fell to communism when the South lost the war, a common viewpoint is that Australia's involvement contributed to a successful resolution as it strengthened anti-communist, democratic governments throughout Southeast Asia. In doing this, it prevented the dominoes of Southeast Asia from falling, which protected Australia from facing a direct communist threat. An extract from Article 4 of the SEATO Pact highlights how Australia aimed to prevent more countries from falling to communism by proactively protecting them from it through forward defence. The treaty states that any country which suffered an armed attack would be given military support by the other countries in the treaty, provided they could unanimously agree the attack posed a significant threat. This implies that Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War was successful, as it ensured countries in Southeast Asia were protected by a collective security agreement, preventing them from falling to communism. Moreover, as part of Australia's aims to foster anti-communism in Southeast Asia, Australia supported the development of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, in 1967, a regional bloc including Malaysia, the Philippines, Thailand, Singapore, and Indonesia. In 1978, Singaporean Foreign Minister Sanathan B. Rajaratnam highlighted how the Asian bloc had always been aligned to Australia and the US's foreign policy, suggesting that the countries involved supported an anti-communist stance, thus forming a strong ideological foundation for the suppression of communism in Southeast Asia. The significance of ASEAN to protecting countries in Southeast Asia from falling to communism is highlighted by historian Frank Frost, who wrote that Australian Prime Minister Gough Whitlam recognised how ASEAN could help stabilise relations among its members and contribute positively to regional security in 1972. As a result, in April 1974, Australia became ASEAN's first external partner with a direct multilateral connection. This implies that Australia recognised the importance of close ties within Southeast Asia to halting the spread of communism. In addition, Ashley Ekins' analysis of the course and outcomes of the Vietnam War notes how the support of countries such as Australia and the United States towards the Vietnam War bought time for neighbouring, emergent nations in Southeast Asia, allowing them to achieve political stability and economic security, highlighting how the pressure against communist expansion in Vietnam helped developing Southeast Asian countries implement barriers to the ideological expansion of communism through political development, legislative measures, and economic stability. This perspective is highly significant in highlighting how the efforts of Australia and the other belligerents in supporting South Vietnam during the war helped support the strengthening of anti-communism in the rest of the Southeast Asian region.
Or was it? In contrast to the view that Australia's involvement meaningfully strengthened multilateral connections and anti-communist sentiment in the Asia-Pacific, the futility of the conflict is echoed through various accounts. Vietnam War veteran Bill Denny offers an emotionally charged first-hand account that powerfully illustrates the futility many soldiers felt after the fall of South Vietnam. Reflecting on the withdrawal of Australian and American forces in 1975, Denny recalls how he never really got over the desertion of those who had so comprehensively fought to support and protect. His statement reveals deep regret and disillusionment, not only at South Vietnam's collapse, but at the seemingly erasure of their sacrifices. This sentiment reflects a broader viewpoint that Australia's war efforts were ultimately in vain. Denny's account supports the argument that Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War was strategically ineffective. Despite many years of military commitment, Vietnam's rapid fall to communist forces shows how the military gains were fleeting, ultimately implying that Australia's participation failed to stop communism and came at an arguably unnecessary human cost. While Denny's emotional tone may introduce a degree of subjectivity, it also provides an authentic insight into the personal toll the war took on Australian soldiers. His proximity to the conflict and contemporary experience made his account highly reliable and valuable in reflecting on the war's legacy. Veteran Denny's personal account is further supported by Vietnam War historian Peter Edwards, who asserts that the Vietnam era is still identified with diplomatic, military, and political failure. This concise statement reinforces the broader perspective that Australia's involvement in the war was unsuccessful on multiple fronts, and that its legacy remains one of controversy and division. Edward highlights three key failures, each of which illustrates how the war's costs far outweighed its achievements. Let's elaborate on these three pillars of failure. Foremost, the military failure of Australia's involvement is underscored by casualty statistics. According to the Australian War Memorial, over 3,600 Australian soldiers were wounded or killed during the conflict. This highlights the severe human cost of a campaign that ultimately failed to achieve its core goal of halting the spread of communism in South Vietnam, deepening the perception that the war effort was both ineffective and unjustified. Second, the diplomatic failure is highlighted by the Australian War Memorial commenting on the broader diplomatic consequences of the Vietnam War through its reflection on the Cambodian invasion. The use of the Ho Chi Minh Trail through Cambodia not only drew the nation into the war, but also destabilized its political system, ultimately pushing Cambodia towards communism. While the invasion succeeded in capturing large quantities of North Vietnamese arms, destroying bunkers and sanctuaries, and killing enemy soldiers, it ultimately proved disastrous. By bringing combat into Cambodia, the invasion drove many people to join the underground opposition, the Khmer Rouge. This extract reveals how instead of containing communism, the conflict destabilized neighboring Cambodia, indirectly contributing to the rise of Khmer Rouge, Cambodia's communist party, whose brutal regime led to the death of millions. This outcome not only directly challenges the notion that Australia's participation in the war helped prevent the domino effect spread of communism in Southeast Asia. In fact, it suggests that the war intensified regional instability and accelerated the very threat it aimed to suppress. Finally, the political failure of the war is underscored by the contemporary widespread public protests across Australia. Mass demonstrations, most notably the moratoriums, saw thousands of Australians participate in marches, sit-ins, and acts of civil disobedience. These protests were driven by growing public disillusionment and are a reliable reflection of public sentiment at the time, implying that, first, support for the war significantly declined as its human costs rose, and second, the conflict deeply divided Australian society, creating unrest and mistrust in the government decisions around foreign policy and conscription. Thus, these protests provide powerful evidence that many Australians saw the war as futile, unjustified, and misaligned with national values. The fact that such large-scale protests emerged suggests that the war failed not only abroad, but within Australia's political landscape as well.
All in all, although Australia's role in Vietnam helped strengthen anti-communist alliances and demonstrated a commitment to forward defence, these gains were fleeting compared to the costs. Despite years of sacrifice, Vietnam still fell to communism, neighboring states were destabilized, and at home, the war tore open political and social divides. The human cost was immense, and the supposed strategic gains proved hollow. In the end, Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War ultimately failed to achieve its central purpose, leaving behind more scars than safeguards, and raising the enduring question of whether it was ever worth the sacrifice.